This lesson will cover Chapter 12 on Congress, and it is Part 2. We will talk about the specific process of policymaking. As you know and have been taught many times over, Congress is the legislative branch and they make laws. It is the central responsibility of Congress. Not all areas of congressional policymaking are listed in the Constitution, as mentioned before. There are powers that are enumerated, but there are also powers that are implied. All other functions are related to the policymaking role. One of the powers that the legislative branch has, or Congress has, is the power of oversight. And this is a major power that's reflected in checks and balances. So, oversight is the process by which the legislative branch checks the executive branch to ensure that the laws Congress has passed are being administered in keeping with legislators' intent. This can be done by holding presidents accountable to enforcing laws, finding out how the bureaucratic agencies are also regulating those laws. Oversight serves as a check on the executive branch because the federal bureaucracy implements laws as part of the executive branch. So it is not feasible for it to be in the hands of just one individual. That's why when we think about all of the different departments and all of the cabinet members that head those departments, it does demonstrate really how vast and large the executive branch is. Some of the specific ways that Congress can apply oversight would be through holding congressional hearings, confirmation hearings on presidential appointees, and budgetary appropriations that determine funding of an executive department. Although the president or executive will propose a budget, it really is up to Congress as to whether or not they take those directives in the proposal or they change them and appropriate funds differently. Another thing that Congress is responsible for is agenda setting. So they determine which policy issues the federal legislature should consider. By no means do bills get looked at in chronological order. Oftentimes we see that Congress pays attention to issues that the public is very much placing pressure on them to do, or the media is placing pressure on them to do. So again, that agenda very much is set and can be influenced by other institutions as well. At the beginning of the term, the House and the Senate leaders announce their goals for the coming season, and agenda setting is influenced by, again, as mentioned before, public discourse. So, Congress is a bicameral legislature. We have two chambers, the House and the Senate. So, these are some specific, unique features of each of these chambers. The House is much larger, it has far more members. These members are representative of districts in each of the states, and they're based in population. There's a shorter electoral cycle, each term is 2 years. And there also is a narrow constituency. So again, we're looking at congressional districts as opposed to the states. Generally, being a member of the House is less prestigious than being a senator. If you think about it, you really only have to be popular or gain the votes of the constituents in a specific district as opposed to the diverse population of the state. We learned about this in Unit 1, but in the House, that's where all revenue bills originate. So it's not as if the House is the only chamber that is responsible for voting on revenue bills, but it is where those bills are initiated. House members are going to be less reliant on their staff than Senate, as again, they are more connected to a smaller district, and also their power is vested in leaders and committee chairs. Comparing those features to the Senate, we know that the Senate is much smaller. Again, there are 2 representatives for each state, regardless of population, in the Senate. The Senate is more that chamber that reflects the limitation of the federal government's power becoming too big. Remember that historically speaking, senators were appointed by state legislatures. They are currently now, since the passing of the 17th Amendment, they are popularly elected, but when you think about the history, it does make sense as to why this particular chamber would have been more reflective of state rights and preserving state rights over the expansion of federal power. Senate terms are longer, they're about 6 years. This was a way to try to alleviate or insulate their pressure that they might be receiving from constituents so that they may act in a way that would be considered more of an educated or wise approach, would be looking out for the entire state as opposed to a small district or constituency. The Senate is much more prestigious. They also have significant roles when it comes to appointment. So they ratify treaties and confirm presidential nominees. They also are far more reliant on their staff. Again, it's much harder to know everything there is to know about an entire state, so they rely very heavily on staff members to inform them and to educate them also on some of the tasks that they should be responsible for, should be paying attention to. And power is distributed more evenly when we're looking at each of the 50 states. Next, we're going to talk about the legislative process. So from when a bill actually is introduced all the way to if a bill is lucky enough to get presidential approval, or maybe even a presidential override. You can find a more detailed depiction as well as description of the legislative process beginning on page 384 of your textbook. So it is important to note that a bill must be introduced by a member of the House or a member of the Senate. Anyone can write up a bill. The president can write up a bill, special interest groups can write up a bill, one of your parental units can write up a bill, you can write up a bill, but it has to be formally introduced in one of the chambers by an actual representative, whether that be a House representative or a Senate representative. We tend to refer to the introduction as the House member or Senate member formally proposing the bill. Next, the bill goes to committee review, and this is where subgroups within the House and Senate, which are composed of legislators who have expertise on the subject matter of the bill, review the bill first. This is often where we see bills die. They don't move past subcommittees, but if they're lucky enough to get past subcommittees and they move to the House and Senate, they need House and Senate approval. If the bill makes it out of committee, a majority of members in the House and the Senate must approve it. It's very common for bills that are running through the House and running through the Senate to have minor differences or discrepancies between them, even though they technically are of the same bill. So what ends up happening is a conference committee has to come together to reconcile any of the differences to ensure that the House and the Senate do vote on the same bill. Essentially, the conference committee is where you get the final version of the bill that should be voted upon. And once the bill moves past a full House vote and full Senate vote after the conference committee reconciliation and that one version is voted upon, it can go to the president, and one of four things can happen. The two major things that can happen is the president can sign the bill into law, or the president can veto the bill and it dies. But there are two other ways that this can happen as well. So a bill can also pass without the president formally signing off on the bill or signing it into law. And that happens if Congress is in session, 10 days pass, they're still in session, and the president does nothing, it becomes law. The pocket veto is also another way that a bill can be vetoed. And in this case, if Congress lets out and convenes, it means that if there isn't 10 days there for the bill to become law without presidential approval, then it dies. So for example, if 8 days pass and Congress lets out, then it is a pocket veto. It does not become a law, but the president does not formally veto the law. All right, a few specifics with the legislative process. When a bill is introduced in the House of Representatives, members of the House will place bills in a hopper. This is a wooden box on the desk at the front of the House of Representatives. Bills are then referred to as HR and then a number that follows it. So an example would be HR 207. Since the Senate is smaller, the process is less formal. You don't have to go through a whole process of figuring out the rules. There's no rules committee. The speech does happen on the Senate floor. There's a written draft to the Senate clerk that is made and an amendment to the pending piece of legislation. Bills are then referred to as S followed by a number, and so an example would be S711. If you go to the House of Representatives website or even the Senate website, you can find all of the bills that are actually actively in legislation, and you can read about those bills. Bills are pretty extensive, so sometimes it's easier to just read a summary of the bill. Getting into specifics of committee review, there is a seniority system. So when we look at whatever administration happens to be in power, basically the political party that's in power in that chamber of Congress, they're going to ensure that all of their committees are also headed by members of those parties. They're chairing those committees. In addition, they'll also have an advantage by means of numbers so that the voting in those committees also favor the political party in power. And typically those chairs or heads of those committees are also the longest running members. Although seniority system is not formal and is not required, it is most typical. Committee heads are elected by secret ballot, and for congressional record, it's a formal record of all actions taken by Congress, and it is often the reason for the death of most bills, why bills die in subcommittees. There are two ways we can refer to types of committees in Congress. There are standing committees, which are permanent, and select committees, which are temporary. Examples of permanent standing committees would be the House Appropriations Committee or the Armed Services Committee. Select committees are often committees that are created because a specific event may have happened, and bills that come before Congress that may not fit or classify as being necessary for the expertise of any specific committee may actually create a more specified select committee that's temporary. One other way that I forgot to mention where a bill can become law is the override of a presidential veto. So Congress can, if they can get 2/3 of both chambers of the House and the Senate, then they are able to override that presidential veto and the bill becomes law. You want to know the titles of roles of congressional leadership. One of the most significant leadership positions is being Speaker of the House. They're second in line to the president, and they're the leader of the House of Representatives. They work with House Majority Leaders, which is the leader of the majority party in the House, and they also help develop and implement the majority party's legislative strategy. In addition to the Speaker of the House and the Majority Leader, there's also a Majority Whip. And I like to think of a Majority Whip as, again, being reflective of the majority party, but their responsibility is really whipping the votes into place, making sure that they're going back and forth to each of the members of that political party in that chamber and making sure that they have the votes that they need to get a bill passed. Majority whips are often behind the scenes, whereas the Speaker of the House and the House Majority Leader are more, are more inclined to be asked questions by news correspondents and be in the media. Now let's look at congressional leadership. In the Senate, the Vice President serves as the President of the Senate, and the President pro tem usually fills in when the Vice President is not available. They also act as the president for the time, and they're third in line to the presidency. They control the Senate when the Vice President is absent. The real power is actually held in the Senate by the majority leader, and they manage the legislative process, and they act as the spokesperson for the majority. So again, when we're looking at contrast to all the majority leaders, we would refer to them as minority leaders, and those are the leaders of the minority party. Let's talk really quickly about some congressional strategies to try to get bills passed. Log rolling is where members of Congress may agree to vote on a bill in exchange for colleagues voting on another bill. This might be a tactic that could be more efficient when looking at the contrast of political parties. Hey, we'll compromise with you on this bill if you compromise with us on this bill. Now, remember, the House and Senate are often not in the know about everything there is to know that might affect their constituency or their states. And so they rely very heavily on their staff for that information. They may be getting information from their staff where they're collecting it from interest groups. They're really looking at specifics and desires of constituents. Staff might actually be keeping data and looking at that data based in emails that people send, letters that people send, concerns that their constituents have, and then they relay that to members of Congress. And it's also important to note that members of Congress are going to be far more attentive to the concerns of an attentive public. So those are voters who actually are paying attention to politics and are often bringing that attention to the media or through protesting or through civic action. Lastly, we can talk about influences on congressional behavior. Well, we know that Congress is very ideological. When we look at political parties and we look at folks that are going to be much more conservative or much more liberal or progressive, we see that that bleeds into how they are looking at bills and how they make decisions on legislation. Representation is also really important. What does Congress look like? Congress is older, more educated, whiter, more likely to be male than the American population as a whole. And then lastly, the results of elections can determine whether or not we're looking at a divided government or a unified government.